What's up, everybody in YouTube land? We had a couple requests for a couple more matchup guide series videos, so gonna be knocking out a few of those. We just had the Magic Online update yesterday, so we weren't able to stream, but we might be back live today, maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure yet, but in the meantime, we're going to go through a few of these matchup guides. We'll have them broken up into different videos. So if you don't see this one right now, or if you don't see them all together, that's fine. They'll all be uploaded pretty shortly. So some of the requests were like Tron, Scam. What else? Tron, Scam, Affinity. There were like two others. Dredge and Jun Saga. So let's start with Tron, my personal boogeyman of the format. Even if it's not relevant hardly at all right now, it's still a deck that I'm never too excited to run into. And in honesty, Tron is one of the decks that inadvertently caused me to start streaming. And it's really weird to hear. I will explain the background as briefly as I can. So, essentially, with the older builds of Grixis Death Shadow, like your Gurmag Angler, Stubborn Denial, Teamer Battle Rage builds, um, I would always express that like Tron was a matchup that I hated seeing. Like I felt I had good game against it with Thoughtseize, Shadow, Stubborn Denial, all that sort of stuff. Disdainful Stroke or Ceremonious Rejection in the sideboard. So it always felt like I had a reasonable plan, and I wasn't unfavored against Tron by any means. But there would be those hands where you just have like, okay, I've got some cantrips, no threat, a couple stubborn denials, or like a stubborn denial and a disdainful stroke, but I can't get this stub online. And eventually my opponent would just like find Tron, or I'd have a hand with a threat and no permission, and my opponent would just like resolve a worm coil or something. I'd be like, yep, that's how it goes. Um, so I was like looking for ideas one time on, I think the Death Shadow Facebook group, maybe. And all the feedback that I got was basically Tron's a buy. You just Thoughtseize them into Shadow, into Battle Rage, and Stubborn Denial, everything, and it's easy. Like, I've literally people saying, I've never lost to Tron. I've never lost a match to Tron. And I was kind of taken aback by that. So I was like, I mean, yeah, if you just have like the magical Christmas land hand against Tron, like you're probably gonna win that one. But what if you don't? Like, what's your next plan? How aggressively are you mulliganing for this perfect hand? What happens if you don't have uh, two fetch lands, double Thoughtseize, Shadow, Stubborn Denial, Disdainful Stroke, and then just like draw third fetch land, Battle Rage off the top? Like, what's the alternative to this? Because that can't be. It can't be that I'm the only person in the history of Grixis Death Shadow that wasn't experiencing the perfect hand every single game. So that's where the idea for the channel came from. Like, hey, this is really great in theory, and we should have like a 99% win rate against Tron if we're just seeing that every time. But what does the data actually look like? Like, what's the realistic breakdown? What are our real percentages? Not just this theory crafted, oh yeah, just Thoughtseize into Shadow into Stub into Battle Rage. And so yeah, you can blame Tron for us being a YouTube channel and a Twitch stream now. So I guess we might as well add it to the matchup guide. So this is like episode 9, 10, something. I don't know. I think it's 10. Might be 10. I want to say we had 3 left on the front page last time. So let's get our menace up here. All right, you're in a match, game 1 in the blind. How do you recognize that your opponent is on Tron? Um, so 2 avenues this can go down. Number 1 is your opponent leads on Tronland map, in which case I know my opponent is on some Tron variant. It could be mono blue, could be mono green, could be Eldrazi Tron, could be Prison Tron. I don't know, but they're on some sort of Tron variant. And unfortunately, a lot of those different variations play out very differently. Today, we're just talking about like your good old fashioned mono green, get to Ulamog Tron with Karns, Wormcoil, Thragtusk, whatever their payoff happens to be. So how do we identify that that is the variation that we're up against? So one of the first big giveaways is Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere. Typically, like Mono Blue Tron isn't playing these. Eldrazi Tron's not playing them. Prison Tron's not playing them. So that's a pretty big giveaway that your opponent's on like a Sylvan Scrying Ancient version or Ancient Stirrings version of Tron, which is what we're trying to focus on here. Obviously, the Expedition map is a start. It's just not a guarantee. And then cards like Ancient Stirring, Sylvan Scrying to help find Tron lands are a pretty big giveaway. So those are kind of like your no doubters, your Stirring, Scrying, Star, Sphere. Everything else could be kind of variable between different Tron builds, but those are the ones you really want to keep an eye out for. So, all right, you're in game 1. You've identified your opponents on Tron. And we'll kind of discuss a little bit of differences between playing against normal Tron and playing against like Eldrazi Tron or something. But Eldrazi Tron's going to be its own separate video, so I don't want to dive in too deep. The main difference is, especially game 1 against Mono Green Tron, we become the aggressor, period. No questions asked. Like, our job is to get our opponent from 20 to 0 as quickly as we possibly can before they can start playing like Wormcoils and Thragtusk and Karn the Great Creator and stuff that's really going to extend the game for them and allow them to recoup those early turns with a lot of late game haymakers. Against something like Eldrazi Tron, there's going to be times that you're the aggressor, and there's going to be times that you have to play a little bit of the control route and be interacting with things like Reality Smasher and Thought Not Seer and whatnot. But against Mono Green Tron, like, you're the beatdown. Occasionally with some variations like Murktide Shadow or like old school Grixis with Stubborn Denial, you become more of like a Protect the Queen kind of control deck. But at the end of the day, like, the way you win, hit your opponent with threats. So, regardless of what variation, that's a pretty quick turnaround. Like, burn spells are more often than not going to face, because if your opponent does land one of these big planeswalkers, board state dependent, obviously, but most of the time it's going to be kind of game over, especially if it involves like Ugin the Spirit Dragon or Karn for an Ensnaring Bridge in the main deck. Or in like game 1 where you don't have interaction for that bridge. If you have like a K command or a Kroxa, it gets a little bit different, but we'll talk about that. All right, so opponent's on Tron, you're on whatever flavor of Shadow you want to go for. Let's talk a little bit about sideboarding. Well, I guess we can talk a little bit more about how games play out in game 1. Yeah. So Grixis Shadow is kind of everybody's I don't want to say preferred because that's not accurate. Grixis Shadow is the variation of Shadow that I think most people identify with to some extent, whether that be their personal preference, whether it be like the Shadow variant they started on, the Shadow variant they want to play. It's like the most identifiable. So usually it's where I start whenever it comes to talking about a matchup. And for Tron, game one, Grixis Shadow, player draw doesn't matter. Ragavan's going to be like one of your most important cards to be able to get mana advantage quickly. But that's kind of the case with any matchup. Is turn one Ragavan is really nice to see. But as soon as you start getting into like the midpoints of the game, we're assuming that your opponent's kept a hand that allows them to get Tron within the first 3 or 4 turns of the game, and you're looking at ways to interact after that. So if you've got like Thought Seizes, my priority for Thought Seize uh, typically goes something, and it depends on if you've got counter magic. So if you've got like Spell Pierces in hand, then my priority is more on creatures with like Wormcoil Engine, Ulamog if they have the potential mana, Thrag Tusk. I'm not so worried about Walking Ballista. If my opponent's got a bunch of Planeswalkers, then my priority kind of becomes like Ugin the Spirit Dragon just ends the game on the spot. Karn the Great Creator is really good, but Karn into like Ensnaring Bridge, if you can interact with the bridge with like Spell Pierce or Drowning Lock, then I might let them keep the Karn because I can always attack it down using Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, something like that. Um, and then after that, we're starting to look at like ways to get Tron if they don't have Tron online. So, say turn one on the play, you've got a Thought Season and Inquisition. You Inquisition your opponent or Thought Seize, whatever, and they've got 2 Tron lands, Map, Star, uh, Ulamog, Wormcoil, Ugin, or something. So they've got a guaranteed Tron land in that expedition map. So usually, like the guaranteed Tron land is one of the highest priorities when it comes to your hand disruption early. If you can stop them from getting Tron for an extra turn or two, then that's a really big time gap that you've kind of bought yourself. Um, More often than not, when you're going up against Tron, your turn one is like a Ragavan on the play, in which case your opponent's likely to have an expedition map or a star or sphere. And now all of a sudden your hand disruption gets a little distorted. So, like, if I've got turn one Ragavan, my opponent goes Tron land map, and I've got a Thought Seize, uh, and I hit with Ragavan, cast that Thought Seize, and I see my opponent's got a second Tron land, then all of a sudden my priority shifts to like, let me take a payoff. I'm not going to worry about taking a Star, Sphere, Ancient Stirring, Sylvan Scrying, whatever. They're going to have mana. Now I'm focused on let me take the thing that's actually going to kill me. Let me take the Ugin or Wormcoil or whatever. Typically priority, again, going first to things that I have difficulty interacting with, which is like Wormcoil Engine, Ulamog, uh, depending on what kind of shadow build I'm running, like Spell Pierce and whatnot, are easy ways to interact with the big planeswalkers. Drowning Lock can be a little bit rough, so you do have to try to plan out a little bit for cards in the graveyard. And main deck, like Relic of Progenitus, can really throw that off. So don't rely on Drown, but know that it's an option there if you do need it. Um, but as far as game one, it's really just try to buy yourself a turn or two. Game two, that really changes up. I should mention, if you're on the draw and your opponent leads Tron land map, I would lead with a threat. Like, if your opponent's got Tron, they're going to have, or if they have the other Tron land, they're going to have Tron. There's nothing you can do about it. There's no point in Thought Seizing or Inquisitioning right there because your opponent's turn two is pretty set second land crack map. There's going to be like some small percentage of games where you get punished by your opponent going like basic forest Sylvan Scrying on turn two, and they get second Tron land, then the next turn they can play Tron land crack map, and you could have stopped that with Inquisition or Thoughtseize. But the higher likelihood is that they've just got like 2 Tron lands map, and that was the reason they kept the hand. In which case, having Ragavan on the board or Dragon's Rage Channeler, getting in the attack next turn, and then Thought Seizing gives your opponent one more draw step to find a payoff and let you be able to hit that. If they lead on turn one Tron Land Star or Sphere, I would be far more interested in casting that hand disruption spell there on my turn one, because that means they're leaning more into like Ancient Stirrings or Sylvan Scrying on turn two. So I can break up that process of finding Tron. Obviously, they could have like two Sylvan Scryings, but I'd rather take that risk than allow them to untap, get the green mana, and cast Away to Search. And if you're like me, regardless of what you thought sees, they've got another copy on top, so it doesn't matter. All right, post board. So let's talk about sideboarding first off, and then we'll get into like some gameplay lines and things from each side. So from the Tron side, some of the popular bring-ins, most of their sideboard you have to understand is a wish board for Karn. So the vast majority of stuff like isn't coming in. It's just one-offs to be able to grab off Karn. Thrag Tusk is usually coming in to some extent. Gives like a good blocker on the ground, gains little life, leaves a body behind. Beseiju, if you're on like Rakdos Shadow and they expect Blood Moon, then Beseiju is a lot more likely. If you're on like Grixis or something and Alpine Moon is a fairly known quantity, then you might see Beseiju come in for that. You could also see like Nature's Claim. You could see what's the cycle one? It's like one in a green wilt. That's it. Yeah, you could see wilt. You could see something like that, but just some sort of enchantment hate for like Alpine Moon, Blood Moon, stuff like that. Beseiju, like I said, if they don't have it in the main, is likely coming in more because it's just like a free roll card to bring in, right? It's good interaction for the enchantments. I wouldn't worry too much about them like taking you off of mana, but it's there. Board outs are usually going to be something like Karn Liberated is a little whatever. It's not as game ending as the other Planeswalkers are, but it's still really good. Um, I've seen people board down on like Emrakul, Ulamog, whatever. Emrakul especially, I'd probably look at getting out. It's kind of whatever. But some number of that. It's not going to be a huge variation between game one and game two. Just kind of take out some of the clunky payoffs, bring in some of the cheap interaction for our hate pieces. So let's talk about sideboarding from the shadow side. And we'll kind of go like variation from variation. All right, so you're on Grixis. What kind of cards are you interested in bringing in? First off, any of your like hard counter spells. So if you're running like actual counter spell, Disdainful Stroke, Ceremonious Rejection, if Tron's like a big enough deck in your area for those, then those are obviously coming in. Cards like Turok are okay, but you got to be careful. Veil of Summer, which is another one that is in and out of some Tron lists, but Veil of Summer is one that Tron has played a lot more of in the past. I don't think they're as high on it right now, but it's one to at least like know that your opponent could very well have access to. But again, it's not a card that like I'm playing around more often than not. It's just, hey, my opponent could have this. If I can freely play around it without disrupting my own game plan, then I will. So I mentioned Turok, mentioned your hard counter spells. Flusterstorm is one that I've been like on and off of. So it depends on what I'm planning on boarding out. So for example, out of a list like this for me, I'm usually trimming on some number of Unholy Heat. It's good like finishing off a Planeswalker, but most of the time once a Planeswalker comes down, uh, that's enough damage to kind of stop whatever momentum you were getting. It's like you can kill the Karn, the Great Creator, but if you can't interact with the ensnaring bridge, then it doesn't matter. Or you can kill the Ugin, but if they've already wiped away 3 of your threats, killing the Ugin doesn't matter. Like you've already lost that game. Uh, Karn the Great Creator is about one of the exceptions where, hey, it's going to come down, tag one threat, and then you kill it. But that's one of the weaker planeswalkers in the matchup anyway, so I'm not really like warping my game plan around that. Fatal Push is coming out pretty aggressively. Like the only thing Fatal Push does is kill a token off of a Wormcoil Engine or a Walking Ballista. And again, those are both kind of situations where, like, if they hit the battlefield, I'm probably in some trouble anyway. Final cuts could be some number of like Drown in the Lock, especially with Relica Progenitus being so popular in the main deck. They get really dead really quickly, but a lot of it just depends on like how much am I planning on bringing in. So I've started bringing in like Flusterstorm a bit because it gives you interaction for turn 2 Ancient Stirrings or Sylvan Scrying. Helps you interact with Veil of Summer. Can stop like Dismembers, Warping Whales, stuff like that. So it's not as dead as people think it is against Tron. And especially if you're already planning on bringing out like 4 or 5 cards, if you just need an extra spot or two to bring in, because like Flusterstorm is going to be 100% better than Fatal Push. That might be a consideration. On the play, I bring in EE to some extent, because if I'm able to land like turn 1 Ragavan, my opponent plays Tron land map, and I get to like hit them, play out EE, as long as my hand has enough backup to it, and like blow up my Ragavan and their map, but I get to follow it up with a shadow or something, then it's not the worst trade off in the world. It's not preferred. I would rather this be like Kolaghan's Command in that situation, which is obviously another card to bring in. But it also gives like an out to ensnaring bridge in the mid to late game. So if your opponent drops a Karn the Great Creator, gets an ensnaring bridge, plays out the bridge, and you're able to kill the Karn with like an Unholy Heat or attack in with dudes that get under bridge and then EE the way the bridge, that can be a really good way to kind of catch back up on that momentum shift. Other cards for Grixis would be like Alpine Moon's a great bring in. I'll bring in Mystical Dispute sometimes, especially on the play. It's just like a bad mana leak. Like turn 3, if I get to Mystical Dispute a Karn or Wormcoil or something, like that's a fantastic trade off for me. And it didn't really cost me a whole lot, especially if I'm able to start with like a Ragavan into it. Let's see, mentioned Alpine Moon, Kolaghan's Command, really good bring in. If you've got extra copies of like Kroxa or something in the board, it's okay. But again, Relic of Progenitus does make a lot of this like graveyard synergistic stuff kind of awkward. That's about it for Grixis. Let's talk about some of these other variations. So Dimir, again, Stubborn Denial, Flusterstorm, like good counter spells for a lot of the cheap pieces. Stubborn Denial, especially being able to hit any of the planeswalkers, any of the non-creature payoffs, really, really good in the matchup. The Hurkyl's Recall, really good. So kind of that same idea of, hey, if I'm on the play and I play turn 1 land, my opponent plays turn 1 map, and my turn 2, I play Hurkyl's Recall, then I've just set them off of Tron for an extra turn, which could be a very big deal, especially if I've got like, oh, I drew into Force of Negation, or I drew into Brazen Borrower, and now I get to go turn 2, bounce your map. Turn 3, you replayed your map. I bounce it again. Now it's like turn 5 before they get Tron online, hopefully, or turn 4. Turn 4 or 5 before they get Tron online. And maybe I've bought myself enough time to get like Shadow plus Counterspell down, or Murktide plus Counterspell, something. Mystical Dispute, again, one I'm probably bringing in. 1 or 2 copies. But again, it completely depends on like how much stuff you're planning on bringing out. So for me, in something like the Demir list, I'm bringing out Dress Down, Fatal Pushes, Dismember, and I'm boarding in like Stub, Flusterstorm, the Turox, Recall, and then like an EE, or maybe I'm bringing in the Mystical Disputes and the other EE and trimming on like a Murktide if my opponent's got a whole bunch of main deck relics. Maybe I'm trimming on a couple copies of Drown in the Lock for a couple of these sideboard counters, something like that. Let's go down the list. Something like Esper again, Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Turok. A lot of these blue-black variants. Sneezing. A lot of these blue-black variants are going to have very, very similar sideboard plans because hand disruption and counter spells are like a pretty common theme between all of them. In a variation like this, Prismatic Ending, March of Otherworldly Light, really good post board cards to be able to take out like Star, Sphere, Map, anything like that, and Snaring Bridge. How about a non-blue black variant? So if you're messing around with like Golgari or something like that, Terra Sunder is going to be really good. So it allows you to exile everything from Ensnaring Bridge, Star Sphere, Map, Worm Coil Engine, Walking Ballista. You get up to the full 4 mana, you can exile Planeswalkers. A really solid card. Collective Brutality, I would consider. Necromentia can name Tron lands. So especially if you're on the play, just name like the missing Tron land and you get to stop it that way. And you don't care if your opponent's got like a 2/2 zombie or something if you just get to deal with Tron permanently. Again, board outs like Spot Removal coming out pretty easy. Abrupt Decay is pretty solid for the same reason like Hurkyl's Recall is. So turn 2 on the play, you're most of the time you're assuming you're losing game 1 because we do have just like a lot of dead cards in the main deck. So game 2 on the play, being able to Abrupt Decay like their turn 1 map is really, really nice. Shadow Tide. Same thing. Flusterstorms, Alpine Moons, Turox. Not too thrilling. Jund, one of my personal favorites, Jund Shadow. Alpine Moon, a lot more heavily relied on in a matchup like this. So one of the big benefits of like Jund Shadow in the matchup is you've got quick, consistent pressure. So being able to Shadow or Tarmogoyf on turn 2, plus hand disruption, and then have access to like Battle Rage means that you are still in like pure race mode, but you can really, really capitalize on your opponent stumbling a turn. So something like Alpine Moon, just to keep them off of Tron for like 1 turn while they answer it with a Besage or whatever, can be a really big deal. Collector Oof, one of my personal favorites in the matchup. Being able to stop Star Sphere Map from even being activated as soon as turn 2 is huge. Ancient Grudge, same thing as like Abrupt Decay, taking out turn 2 or turn 1 Star Sphere Map, as well as being able to flashback, take out like an Ensnaring Bridge later, Walking Ballista, whatever. Trinisphere. So something like these cards, Brutality for Ancient Stirring, Sylvan Scrying, what's it called? Warping Whale, Dismember, whatever. Usually something like Collective Brutality is lower on my ranking to bring in than like these. But if I've got enough to bring out, which in the case of a version like this, I've got Dismembers coming out, Terminate. I'm probably bringing out some number of like Croxa because of what's it called? Relic of Progenitus, maybe a Wren, then like probably shave some Lightning Bolt or something. So we're looking at like 6, 7 cards coming out for 6 or so here. 6 or 7 or so. Something like that. So it like this brutality, like I said, it's lower on the ranking, but if you've got enough stuff that you're wanting to bring out, I think it's a solid option. Mardu, you've got access to like Necromentia, Turok. So just like fighting over the Tron lands early, fighting off over the payoffs late. Rakdos, Blood Moon, your tier 0 bring in against Tron. Usually they're going aggressively for Tron. So if you're able to like Inquisition or Thoughtseize and take a Star or Sphere early that could give them green and then get a Blood Moon down, then it suddenly becomes like Karn the Great Creator's about all you have to worry about if you're providing a fast enough clock. Turok's fine there. Sultai, again, just like counter spells, hand disruption, nothing too thrilling there. So last thing, let's talk about like some play patterns post board. We talked about the turn 1 hand disruption versus like a threat on the play or on the draw. We talked about like Mystical Dispute is a bad mana leak. Dolthy is a card a lot of Shadow variants are interested in. Dolthy Voidwalker. So one of the high impact lines against Tron is being able to go like turn 2 Dolthy, turn 3 Thoughtseize, take like a Karn Liberated and exile one of their Tron lands. Which is like the magical Christmas land scenario, but it's at least something to be conscientious of having access to. Like a Dolthy into a Thoughtseize for just about any payoff can be pretty backbreaking, because not only do you strip them of that thing that interacted with you, but you now get like a hugely overcasted cost or card at a cheap cost. So maybe that could look like turn 1 Ragavan, turn 2 Dolthy plus hand disruption. Maybe it could be turn 1 hand disruption, turn 2 Dolthy, turn 3 like Liliana of the Veil, or turn 1 Ragavan, turn 2 Dolthy, turn 3 Kick Turok. Bunch of different options or a bunch of different forms that option can take. So just be conscientious of those lines. But don't keep a hand just because it has like Dolthy, Thoughtseize, and nothing else going on. Because there is a reasonable chance that your opponent's got like Dismember or something that might be able to interact with that Veil of Summer. So you don't want to put like all your eggs in on that basket. But if it's something that's like supplemental to your primary plan, like turn 1 Ragavan, turn 2 hand disruption is a reasonable primary plan. But turn 2 Dolthy, turn 3 hand disruption is not. So if that Dolthy like slots into an already functional hand, go with it. If you're keeping the hand because it's got Dolthy Thoughtseize, then you're probably going to have a little bit of issues. Unless it's like Dolthy Thoughtseize, Alpine Moon, a couple lands, Tarmogoyf, something like that. Then it might be a little bit better. Play patterns. Let's talk about a couple little. Where'd you go to? A couple little tips and tricks here. One good one that people know for the most part, but for the sake of the video, I'll say it anyway. Your opponent's got like a Worm Coil engine or something, and you've got a couple threats. You can always attack into the Worm Coil and like kill your own threat before damage so that they don't gain the life. If you have like a Delirium Unholy Heat, you can also kill the Worm Coil engine before damage so they don't gain life, but they do get like the lifelink token after it. So make sure you're able to outpace that a little bit. Dress Down is also a great way of dealing with Worm Coil or Walking Ballista. So if you dress down in response to the Walking Ballistic being cast, then it doesn't enter with any counters and just like immediately goes away. If you dress down with the Worm Coil on the field, it loses the lifelink Death Touch and it loses the Death Trigger. So it no longer makes the 2 artifact worms whenever it dies. So then you just have to deal with the vanilla 6/6, which isn't the most unreasonable thing to have to deal with. There's a lot of times that I'll let my opponent I'll have a counter spell of some sort. I'll let my opponent resolve a Karn, go get an ensnaring bridge, and then cast a bridge and counter that. Mainly so I just get the ensnaring bridge out of the sideboard and into the graveyard, so that if they have another Karn, unless they have like a relic or something in between, they can't get that bridge again. So I don't have to worry about that. Uh, that can backfire if your opponent like Karns for a Sundering Titan or something and you can't counter that. So it is really dependent on whether or not they have like Tron mana online, or if they just have 4 random lands and they're playing Karn off that and going to get bridge. So just something to keep in mind. Like a bridge in a graveyard is a lot less scary than a bridge in the sideboard. Um, Usually they're not running multiple bridges. Let's see. Pithing Needle is a good sideboard option to bring in if you're running it. Can name anything from expedition maps on 1 to planeswalkers. Do not name star or sphere. So Pithing Needle specifies activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. Star and Sphere, both mana abilities. Pithing Needle will not shut those off. So map, relic, O-Stone, whatever, name those. Name planeswalkers. Name Walking Ballista. Do not name Star or Sphere. If you're running Alpine Moon, usually the safest option is to name the Tron land that your opponent does not have in play. That way you're not giving them free green mana for something like Nature's Claim or Wilt or Force of Vigor, whatever. So if they've got like stars or our power plant, name mine. That way, if they play out the mine, they do not get active Tron. They get two Tron lands and a Rainbow land. But the Tron lands are both only tapping for 1. But like I said, you keep them from having free green mana for Veil, for any of the enchantment hate, whatever it may be, cycling Besage You, blah blah blah. And you at least make them waste that next turn, like playing out that Tron land using the green mana then. And hopefully not having a follow-up. Anything else? I think that's about it. Hopefully this video helps you in some of your endeavors against Tron. And as always, feel free to drop some comments about the next matchup that you'd like to see, and we'll be happy to go over it. So I will catch y'all later on stream. Adios for now.